This spring I made a 1917/18's outfit after stumbling across this guidebook in an antique shop. Feeling inspired, I set out to go on a trip following the guidebook, staying at the hotels it recommended, seeing the sights, discovering what had changed and what hadn't over the 100 years since the guidebook was published. This guidebook was written and published at the tail end of World War I and bears the marks of the war. There are adverts asking for donations to supply tents on the West Front. I'd like to think whoever bought this book was planning to go on a Highland tour after the war was over. And I do believe they did. The book is well used, and I like to imagine it guided the person's many trips discovering Scotland. I know nothing of the previous owner, only that someone named Thurble once wrote their name on the first page. Armed with the illustrated guidebook and ye old Google, I started planning the trip. We elected to drive for this trip, and motor cars were even advertised in the book. Our first stretch being Perth, Inverness, Ullapool. Then south and west to Skye, south again to Fort William, and then home. Although not technically the Highlands, we had to stop at Doune for the beautiful castle. And it's a really lovely old stone castle, absolutely beautiful lighting, and it was really nice walking about and learning about the history. This is a really famous castle, and you might even recognise it. It's been in a lot of movies, including, for example, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. However, we were going on a Highland trip, so we needed to get into the Highlands. The second stop of our day was at Scone Palace, and Scone Palace is mentioned in the guidebook. Scone Palace, 2.5 miles to the northeast of Perth, a modern castellated mansion, the residence of Lord Mansfield. The public are not admitted. It occupies the site of the old Abbey of Scone, which formerly held the coronation stone of the Scottish kings, now enclosed in the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. This might have been the first stop on Thurble's journey into the Highlands. Had they taken the eastern route from Perth? I will never know. We weren't able to go inside, but we did, however, get to see it from the parking lot, and it's really lovely, and I made a little friend. He thought I had treats, but I didn't, so he was a little bit disappointed. However, we had a long day of driving, so onwards north to Inverness. Now, we didn't stop very long in Inverness. We did, however, take a little stop at the Waverley Hotel because I'd seen this drawing in the guidebook and I thought it would be really lovely to stand where the artist that drew this advert stood to draw this illustration. There's a few new buildings that popped up around it, but otherwise the facade is looking very similar. There seems to be a guest house in the building nowadays, but we had plans to travel further north to Ullapool. As we were running out of daylight, our journey took us northwest and up to Ullapool, where we were staying the night at the Caledonian Hotel. I had to get the video in the morning as it was pitch black by the time we arrived. We also arrived after every single shop and restaurant was closed, like literally within minutes, so we had crisps for dinner. Now, the Caledonian's exterior resembles really closely what it looked like in 1917, 18-ish. The interior has obviously been updated since, thankfully, but I really like that you can see the original hotel in the now hotel. You get me. In Ullapool, we spent the morning walking around down by the harbour and having a look at the McBrain steamboats. We had planned to take a trip over to Lewis, but it didn't end up happening this time. The ferry that does go over to Lewis is the same company that the Highlands Guidebook talks about. Now, Ullapool, according to the guidebook, is a village established by the British Fisheries Association in 1788. It's very specific. The vicinity is very beautiful and visitors may enjoy good and safe bathing, sea fishing, trouting, and there is a splendid golf course. Our first proper stop of the day was at the gorge, described as the Foss of Messach in the guidebook. Scrappy Steve came along on this trip, but he kinda comes and goes as he pleases, so I don't know where he was half the time. The comparatively unknown Falls of Messach, unique in their characters as far as Scotland is concerned, the uppermost is particularly beautiful and resembles nothing so much as the graceful drapery of a Shetland shawl. The scenery all along the ravines through which the stream flows is of the most romantic nature. It's a really beautiful whitewater river, and I totally get the connection between the Shetland shawl and the river. It's got this lovely old Victorian bridge stretching across it, so you can stand straight over the gorge and just, with like a huge drop down, and just stare into the abyss. The area now belongs to the National Trust for Scotland, and they're working on restoring the natural area, and they've also set up a little cafe and a parking lot. Now on the way south, we stopped at Flowerdale. The guidebook describes Flowerdale briefly. Flowerdale House, an 18th century mansion between the hotel and the pier, Flowerdale, and its fine waterfall. So we walked towards the waterfalls following the signs, but we honestly couldn't really find it. It took a really long time just like walking along this kind of meh road. So, you know, we just ended up going back. We did spot a horse on the way though, so that's nice. We also saw a few pheasants, and some ducks and some geese. And on the way down again, we did spot the Flowerdale House in the hillside. You can't really go up to it since it's privately owned, but it does look really beautiful and it's worth a little peek. Then we continue south again, passing, Birchwood. That seems familiar. Anyways, next area we drove through was Westeros. No, not Westeros. Wester Ross. We stopped at Grinyard Bay to look at the seals and Anthrax Island. Thanks, Churchill. Passing Loch Arran and crossing the Straith of Kyleakin. Over the sea to Skye. Which now has a bridge, but in 1917-18 you would have had to take the ferry across. The bridge was only built in like 1995, so it's quite recently. Now, according to the guidebook, Kyleakin is named after the Norwegian king Hako, who sailed through it in 1263. I have no idea who Hako is. It's spelled like taco? I'm guessing they mean Falkland? Timescale matchup, but anyways. On the Skye shore, there are ruins of Castle Moyle, built by a Danish princess nicknamed Saucy Mary, who stretched a chain across the sound and allowed no vessel to pass without paying her toll. Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. Near the castle is a village bearing the same name as the strait and situated on the coast of Skye. The village of Kyleakin is a pleasant resting place for the tourist, and especially for the artist, as it displays some of the finest landscapes in the Western Highlands. I agree, it's really beautiful, the colours are amazing. In Kyleakin was where we stayed the night at the King's Arms, which was listed in the guidebook. Next morning we explored Skye. The first stop is Broadford, where we looked at the Broadford Hotel, which looks pretty Victorian still. Behind the hotel you can see Bain na Caillich, which means the peak of the old woman, which in this context refers to Saucy Mary, who we've heard about before. We also stopped by this lovely little pier to have a look at Campbell's Temperance Hotel, which is currently being restored. However, a temperance hotel is something that you see quite often in these books, and it just means that there's no alcohol on the premises for people who are sober, because most hotels have a pub. Now, crossing the island, we headed to the ferry pools along a very rickety road, and on the way we had to stop and help some tourists change their tire. They spoke very little English and we spoke absolutely zero Italian, but we somehow managed to help them get the wheel changed. And I was still wearing like my fancy outfit, which I thought was quite funny. This lady in like Edwardian-esque outfit just coming to change your tire. We then arrived at the ferry pools. It was really windy and rainy, and the river was far too full to be doing any sort of swimming, even though I really wanted to. But it was really beautiful with the mist and flowing water, and it was really, in Norwegian I would say trolsk, which I guess the best translation would be magical, but like it doesn't quite encapsulate what it means. It just means something magical, but usually in like a natural sense. Like you would usually describe nature or the stillness of something or the waves of something. Oh well, anyways, that's my Duolingo lesson for you. We then travelled north along the coast. We stopped at a little cafe called Bog Myrtle and had a nice coffee and lunch. It's a cafe and second-hand bookshop, so I picked up these lovely costume books. And I was very tempted to buy this Legend of Drizzt book because it has a special place in my heart of little 13-year-old me. However, I do have a copy somewhere in my parents' house, so I'm gonna leave it for someone else. Then the journey goes onwards, north towards Dunvegan. 22 miles from Portree is the site of one of the most interesting of the historic castles of Scotland. It is the seat of the chiefs of the MacLeods. The great treasure of the castle is the fairy flag said to have been taken by one of the MacLeod's Saracen chief during the Crusades. It's a really beautiful castle and they have a lot of really interesting historical items on display. They have these really lovely stays that I absolutely adore and a waistcoat that was apparently worn by Bonnie Prince Charlie himself. And there's this lovely sporran with a Highland Co. Now the day was running short and it was just raining more and more and more and getting more and more windy. We decided to drive back to the King's Arms for our second night. On the way we were, however, briefly blessed by the MacLeods. The clouds parted and we got to meet some coos. Now the coos might be quite docile and friendly, but do keep at least an arm's length distance over the fence when you're looking at them because they do have huge horns, and if they get angry with you, they can gorge you. The next morning we decided to go to the Old Man of Storr, which is a classic visit in Skye. And according to the Guidebook, Storr Rock is 2,365 feet over there, and the Old Man of Storr is an isolated obelisk 160 feet high. Informative. It was really, really windy and my hat tried to escape me yet again. Then we did a stop at Portree. The harbour of Portree, the chief town in Skye, and for the ordinary tourist, the best starting point for excursions on the island. So we did have a look at a few different hotels in Portree from the guidebook. Now, the first one's the Royal, which looks very similar today as it did in 1918, just the road is a bit closer. The Portree looks exactly the same, even the big lettering has been preserved. The Caledonian, it was difficult to find an old reference picture of the Caledonian. It doesn't seem to be very picturesque. You can kind of see it in this Portree hotel pic, to the left, and it seems like it hasn't changed that much. Now we went back across the Kyle of Lochaelch and down to Doune Castle, which is the castle. It's one of the most picturesque castles in Scotland, and it's only mentioned as an aside in the guidebook, but it's very well worth a stop. And it's also the most famous one, adorning shortbread tin boxes, calendars, souvenirs. We stopped on the far side of the castle. It's actually much nicer to get a view from this side. You'll avoid all the cars and tourists and the drones. Well, I mean, you might not know that I've said it, but can't imagine that my advice is gonna bring in a bazillion more tourists. We then headed east and then south along the Caledonian Canal to Fort William, staying at the old West End Hotel, which is now called MGM Muthu. Muthu General Muthu. You can still see quite a bit of the original hotel in the Muthu Hotel. There's a few extensions that they've done, including this winter garden, which is really nice. And at last, our final stop for this journey, the Glencoe Pass. And we have found the exact spot where this photograph in the guidebook was taken. It was real windy and cold, it was absolutely freezing. And I can't imagine trying to get over this pass with a horse carriage, like in the photo, because it would be so bumpy. And that was our journey over for this time. And we were ready to go home. To the Central Belt, to the Lowlands. And that's our journey over for this time. Now some final thoughts. It was an amazing adventure following this old guidebook and seeing the sites someone over 100 years ago also visited. I love how the idea of travelling hasn't changed that much. People 100 years ago were just as excited to see an old castle as today. I feel like by using this guidebook and wearing my silly little outfit, I've gotten a closer connection to the person who previously owned this book. Thurble, I hope you enjoyed your trip to the Highlands as much as me. And I will see you all in my next video.